All right, everybody. We are live here, MythVision podcast. It's a Saturday. I shouldn't be working, but I am because I planned this months ago. We've actually, funny thing is, the teams that you see on the screen changed multiple times over these past few months on both sides. And we finally figured out what the right team is. So we're going to be debating the idea of Isaiah. And I'm going to read off something here that we've had figured out just to give you an idea. It's in the description. But did the book of Isaiah accurately predict the coming of Cyrus, as Jonathan Sheffield and Emma Wingate believe? Or is the work a compilation of 2 or 3, maybe more, collections of oracles that was composed during the Babylonian captivity and later, according to, I don't know for sure, maybe correct me as you present, but I'm assuming Dr. Matthew Monger and Dr. Kipp Davis will take that position. It will also be argued that the prophecy of Cyrus coming was written after Cyrus freed the Jews, in fact, in response to it, and then included the Deutero-Isaian part of the book to describe how God will make Jerusalem the center of his worldwide rule through a royal savior, a Messiah, King Cyrus. To this end, what is fact and what is fiction? So let's introduce our guest. And our first guest, let's introduce the first guest that has never been on the channel, Dr. Matthew Monger. He is an associate professor of Near Eastern Languages and Literature at MF Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society in Oslo. Is that correct? Oslo, Norway?
Oslo. Yeah.
Oslo. Look, I can never get pronunciations correct. Everyone already forgives me for those sins in advance. So Oslo, Norway. He has a BA and MA in theology, as well as a BA in linguistics and an MA in Semitic philology. He was awarded his PhD in 2018 for a dissertation on the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts of the Book of Jubilees. Dr. Monger's research covers a variety of subjects related to the Dead Sea Scrolls and the reception history of Jewish and Christian literature. He has also published a Norwegian translation of the West African Fulani epic.
Yep.
That's right. I got it right. Yeah. Okay. Tell of Kadara. Did I get that one right? Yeah. Kadara. Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay. That is Dr. Monger. We also have Dr. Kipp Davis, if you will, is an independent scholar who has formerly held positions in Canada and Europe and is most renowned for his work in combining forensic approaches and scribal studies for detecting manuscript forgeries. Aspects of his research have been featured in mainstream media outlets such as CNN, The Guardian, Science, National Geographic, and PBS hit documentary series Nova. Dr. Davis is a Hebrew Bible scholar who specializes in Second Temple Jewish literature and history and the Dead Sea Scrolls. He graduated with a PhD from the University of Manchester in 2009 and has published numerous articles and books on the topics of the scrolls, ancient Jewish scribal practices, and the transmission and reception of scripture and other literature. Well, we have both of them. They are on the same team. On the other team that is arguing that the prophecy is true and predicted Cyrus, we have Emma Wingate, who's new to the channel as well. You've never been here. Welcome to MythVision, rolling out the red carpet. Has been competing in Christian Speech and Debate League in CFCA for 5 years. She has debated on topics such as United States energy policy, immigration policy in the European Union, and most recently policies regarding the United States prison system. She decided to study apologetics 4 years ago and has grown to be capable of addressing nearly 100 different topics in competition. As she has grown in the knowledge of God, and she has simultaneously grown in the depth of her love for him. Welcome to MythVision. And Jonathan Sheffield is a Christian apologist with Explore Christianity, serving alongside by Dr. Stephen Boyce and Jonathan Beasley in its associated ministries. Additionally, Jonathan mentors college students at the University of Texas at San Antonio in apologetics as a chapter director for Ratio Christi. As an apologist, Jonathan has defended his thesis in text criticism, the canon of the New and Old Testament, and the historicity of the Bible against Dr. Bart Ehrman, Dr. Richard Carrier, Dr. Mark Goodacre, Dr. Joshua Bowen, Matt Dillahunty, and other relevant scholars, while Jonathan identifies himself as an Anglican autodidact. Given he was born and raised in the Anglican Church, his mother was Jewish and does connect with his Jewish ancestry, which has motivated him to learn more about the Jewish faith and defend its history. How's everybody doing today? Good?
Good.
Great.
Good.
Thanks.
Good.
I think it's good that I start off reading the pericope and correct me where I need to start. I think it's 55.5 just for our audience. And then we're going to get our opening statement started with Jonathan going first and Emma, and then Dr. Kipp and Dr. Monger. First things first.
For clarification, that's 44:26 to 45:5.
Got it. 44:26. Who carries out the words of his servants and fulfills the predictions of his messengers? Who says of Jerusalem, it shall be inhabited, of the towns of Judah, they shall be rebuilt, and of their ruins I will restore them? Who says to the watery deep, be dry, and I will dry up your streams? Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and will accomplish all that I please? He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid. Let me pop up 45 here real quick. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of, to subdue nations before him, and to strip kings of their armor, to open doors before him, so that gates will not be shut. I will go before you, and will level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze, and cut through bars of iron. I will give you hidden treasures, riches stored in secret places, so that you may know that I am the Lord, and the God of Israel, who summons you by name. For the sake of Jacob my servant, of Israel my chosen, I summon you by name, and bestow on you a title of honor. Though you do not acknowledge me, I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me. Now, I want to have our opening statements start with Jonathan. We're going to have 20-minute opening statements, 8-minute rebuttals. We'll have a cross-examination for 40 minutes. We'll do Q&A for 45 to 60, depending on if Superchats come in, and then a 5-minute closing. But yes, oops, dropped. If you're not talking, just mute. That way we don't get an echo. And with that being said, let me get everything up. Clock will start here shortly.
Let me know when you got everything set, and then you can begin the time on my first word.
All right. Are you going to play it? And it's
no, I'm not going to play it. I'm
okay.
just going to scroll through it.
Okay, we're looking good. Let me know when you're ready to start.
Okay. According to the German legal and political philosopher Carl Smith, the specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. As Smith explains in his early and most well-known work, The Concept of the Political, the friend-enemy distinction is the essence of all politics, and it's politically expedient for the state to decide on as an organized political entity to ensure its viability and survival. Smith's use of the friend-enemy distinction to define the political is intimately connected to the question of how we define who is a friend and who is an enemy. For Smith, the decision resides with the political sovereign. That is, the person, body, or institution that has the ultimate authority to enact law and or render a decision during a state of exception, as exemplified in the case of FDR and Winston Churchill's decision to ally with Stalin during World War II. Therefore, given Smith's political philosophy and the state of exception that existed for the Persians to create a new functional state upon its victory over the Babylonians, what best fits Occam's razor for Cyrus's political decision to return a minority of Jews from exile, then allow them to rebuild their temple and city walls at the expense of the Persian treasury, while threatening penalties against anyone who dared to impede their progress? In answering this question, we need to consider the political reality. In most cases, the Jews and their God were defined as the enemy, not a friend of the state. This is undoubtedly the characterization supported in most comments about the Jews in Hellenistic and Roman literature, and the view held by some at the court of the Persian Empire, including the son and successor of Cyrus the Great. Additionally, from the perspective of Dio Cassius, Philostratus, and Tacitus, the Jews were unwilling to adapt their customs to the norm of contemporary society. They did not honor any of the usual gods. Instead, they chose to show extreme reverence for one divinity, while despising all other gods and forms of worship. Effectively, the Jews separated themselves from the nations, an act looked upon as a revolt against humanity. As noted by Dr. Ehrman, the refusal to worship in the ancient world was seen as a danger to the empire's well-being and security of the state. To that end, Jews posed a threat to the sovereignty of the state, especially considering that governance in the ancient world did not include a separation of church and state, hence the designation of public enemy. Remember, it was the cessation of daily sacrifices to Caesar that became the immediate cause of the Jewish war with Rome in 66 AD. This explains why Jewish history presents an almost uninterrupted series of conquests against the state of Judea, with nearly every major empire either partaking in the capital's capture, occupation of its lands, or persecution of its citizens. However, the political sovereigns of Cyrus and Alexander the Great tolerated the Judaic theocracy. The Jewish people procured a host of preferential privileges and a reprieve from any apparent violent variation or occupation of their lands. The Jewish nation hadn't achieved this at any point in its history, even to this day. These observations deviate significantly from most known data points, representing two statistically significant anomalies. So, how did the Jews and their God become the friends of Cyrus the Great? According to Xenophon, Cyrus's political interests focused on securing the stability of the Persian Empire and warding off any dangers posed to the state and his security. Therefore, Cyrus courted and defined as friends of the state those he considered very powerful, well-armed, and well-organized. As Xenophon records, Cyrus fostered goodwill towards powerful nobles and influential citizens. They benefited from Cyrus's political actions and friendship. While those people had wealth, power, influence, and access to Cyrus's court, the dispossessed Jews did not. According to Xenophon, people of the Jews' disposition would not have had any value to Cyrus or been able to exert political influence in his court to lobby special interests. Be that as it may, we must also consider that Cyrus was not a man of the Enlightenment. As Xenophon reports, Cyrus was the most devout in his worship of the gods, a man who never failed to sing hymns to the gods at daybreak or to sacrifice daily to them. From Cyrus's worldview, the gods were also part of the friend-enemy distinction, which explains why upon his entry into Babylon, he had the images and shrines of the local gods erected and concerned himself with the daily worship of the chief god of the city, Marduk. From Cyrus's view, these actions represented a direct attempt to rally the gods of Babylon and the priestly class to warm the hearts of Babylonian people behind his cause. Additionally, Cyrus understood that his compliance as a servant of the gods would impact his celestial support. His father taught him early on to recognize the signs of the gods and not doubt the divine revelations, but understand the counsels of the gods and obey them. The historical lens provides another critical layer to understand Cyrus's political decisions, allowing us to peer through the paradigm of Cyrus's God-fearing eyes. All things considered, if we intend to follow the facts and clear evidence concerning today's question, the book of Isaiah will provide the simplest explanation for Cyrus's political decision to return the Jews from exile, allowing them to rebuild its temple and state of Jerusalem. Evidence of the fact is documented in the Antiquities of the Jews and the book of Ezra, attesting to Cyrus's knowledge of Isaiah's prophecy, known to him through his reading of Isaiah, which then necessitated him to take such actions, giving his worldview. Cyrus would naturally ally himself with a powerful god he felt could predict his victories, to preserve his kingdom in Persia, which explains his otherwise preferential treatment for a minority of Jews. Furthermore, the preceding flurry of circumstantial evidence will establish a set of substantial facts from which one could logically infer and corroborate the fact in question. Firstly, Cyrus' establishment of the king's eyes and ears served to liberally reward those who reported to him whatever it was to his interest to hear. If the publication of Isaiah existed previously, this mechanism would have certainly flushed it out and brought it into the public purview of Cyrus. By contrast, if the Jews decided to throw caution to the wind and have the audacity to fabricate a so-called to Isaiah or proclaim such a statement in response to the philanthropy of Cyrus, the king's eyes and ears would have exposed the deceptive act deemed as mocking the king's name. This would have resulted in severe penalties, then exploited by the neighboring city-states to nullify a permit they were already protesting with the Persian Empire. Yet no ancient tome reported any such deception, given the book of Isaiah was echoed publicly throughout the synagogues without any sounding of alarm from the Persians. Secondly, the neighboring city-states petitioned the Persian Empire for the Jews to cease the refortification of Jerusalem, asserting that the project would lead to lawlessness and rebellion on the part of the Jews. Are we to believe that a small religious minority of Jews held more political sway than the noble city-states of Syria, Babylon, Phoenicia, and Samaria, considering the Persian Empire was especially dependent on Tyre for its naval fleet in the Mediterranean? Yet in the end, Darius I upheld the decision to side with the Jews, threatening penalties against any who dared impede their progress. Thirdly, we must consider that Cyrus allowed a community perceived by his empire as rebellious and seditious to go ahead and refortify Jerusalem, only to risk a revolt in the preceding years. However, Cyrus's son halted the efforts at Jerusalem on account of this threat to the state in his administration. So what influenced these two great Persian kings to make such a stark difference in their political decisions concerning the Jews? Lastly, these are the objective realities. The book of Isaiah exists. Cyrus returned the Jews from exile. Jerusalem and the temple were rebuilt. The king financed these projects. The temple's treasure was returned. The honor of their forefathers were reinstated. Supplies and materials were given for temple sacrifices, and Cyrus threatened penalties against those who impeded the Jews' progress. These are the observable facts of history, and the book of Isaiah provides the simplest explanation for Cyrus's political decision towards the Jews. In conclusion, this event in the annals of Jewish and Persian history is a microcosm encapsulating the problems faced by advocates of a naturalist interpretation of history. According to the Russian philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev and novelist Mark Twain, attempting to explain the historical events and the destiny of the Jewish people from the materialist standpoint is certain to court defeat. And with that, I stop my time, and thank you, Dr. or Matthew and Kipp, for allowing me to present my part of the thesis.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. We'll go to Emma now. You actually had a little bit of time left. All right. Emma, let me know when you're ready. And do you have her presentation ready?
Yes, I do. I'll go ahead and can you mute my mic for me?
Yes.
All right, I'm ready to begin.
You are good to go.
In all trials, there are generally two types of evidence presented to the court: testimonials and exhibits. Testimonials are what a witness says, while exhibits refer to physical objects to prove some point. Evidence helps judges and juries deliberate the merits of the case, what's true and what's not true. In this debate, however, there's really nothing for the court or jury to deliberate, given there is no manuscript authority, no physical or testimonial evidence for the separate existence at any time of the two or three supposed divisions of Isaiah. In fact, the Isaiah scroll was found in its entirety, a 24-foot-long manuscript with all 66 chapters intact. Furthermore, this division is not found amongst the various factions of the Jews, nor is it represented in the Greek or Aramaic translations. While there are multiple apocryphal records of Ezra, Baruch, and Daniel, there is only one Isaiah mentioned. Even the Talmud, which represents the collections of writings that cover the full gamut of Jewish law and tradition, has two separate traditions. Yet the various groups that subscribe to either the Babylonian or Jerusalem text only recognize one Isaiah. Presuming for a moment that the multiple Isaiah theory is correct, then the school of thought should at minimum provide the associated volume and type of evidence that Ehrman, Metzger, and Wallace can document in their case against the originality of the long ending of Mark. But alas, this school of thought can't establish similar empirical grounds for its case, thus severely reducing the probability of its hypothesis. Case in point, of the 1,800 extant Greek manuscripts of Mark, the 8,000 plus in Latin and around 1,000 in the Syriac, advocates against the originality of the long ending of Mark can produce at least 2 early manuscripts in the Greek, i.e. the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus, the testimony of Boventius in the Vetus Latin, and the Sinaitic in the Syriac to support their theory of an amendment. However, even such slim evidence as this does not exist for proponents of the multiple Isaiah author hypothesis. Additionally, where is the relevant physical evidence of actual annotations and marks and the extant manuscripts indicating a second or third Isaiah was amended to the text? And where is there an indication that second or third Isaiah was the byproduct of another author? Ehrman, Metzger, and Wallace can at least cite a meager 13 supporting examples, like Minuscule 199, that reports a variation of notations that state, in some of the copies, the section from Mark 16, verse 9 through 20 is not found. Elsewhere, these scholars can also produce an Armenian manuscript from the 10th century that is uniquely separated from that section of the Gospel with a note saying of Arston the Prevester, possibly indicating a person of interest of known historical value to have authored the text. Yet, the multiple Isaiah hypothesis has no documented person of interest or relevant annotations of this kind. What this school of thought does appeal to is a so-called gap at the end of chapter 33 in the Great Isaiah Scroll to establish its theory on dual authorship. Question: how do they lay a proper legal foundation for its gap assumption apart from citing an ancient witness with personal knowledge of the artifact to validate that assumption? These manuscripts don't have a relevant equivalent of a Jerome to provide that information. Therefore, the assumption cannot be corroborated. Fortunately for us, the Jews, who are relevant witnesses and guardians of its sacred text, identified this gap and others of its kind in Isaiah and Jeremiah as a standard, unambiguous grammatical device showing a hard separation of paragraphs, not a sign of dual authorship. Gaps in manuscripts are not a strange phenomenon in textual studies. The one in Vaticanus actually has relevance to the Mark 16 debate and is followed by the closing title of the book, with a third blank column that can take on several meanings or nothing at all. Whereas the gap assumption in chapter 33 of Isaiah lacks relevance and would seem to contradict its own literary analysis and falsify a scholarship that has steadily asserted a second author beginning with chapter 40, not chapter 34. Moving on, while Ehrman, Metzger, and Wallace can at least create an interpretation from the statements of respected fathers like Jerome and Eusebius to argue their case of the manuscript traditions in the early 4th century that is largely devoid of the long ending of Mark, no such interpretation or historical reference can be made for Isaiah existing with only 39 chapters throughout the Jewish synagogues in any period of history. Furthermore, this leads to another important issue to address regarding the multiple Isaiah hypothesis. Given the Academy's assertion that 2nd and 3rd Isaiah were either independent documents joined at some time during the Persian period or written as a supplement and expansion of 1st Isaiah, what theoretical mechanism is documented to explain how the amendment and standardization of Isaiah could have been achieved on such a massive scale among the Jewish synagogues after the destruction of the First Temple? Keep in mind, to standardize the Homeric texts, Pisistratus had to send out communications all over Greece to acquire the known manuscripts of Homer, and then assemble a team of scholars in Athens to compile and standardize a new edition for the citizens of Greece. Uthman's revision of the Quran required the burning of all previous versions and the distribution of a new copy to every Muslim province. Not to mention Jerome's Vulgate required Rome's approval, a full team of scholars at Bethlehem, and the support of Western Christianity. These historical cases all provide objective evidence of its respective texts' editorialization, demonstrating that material traces of such endeavors were meticulously recorded. If modern scholarship's multiple Isaiah theory were well-founded, then it should be able to empirically document for Isaiah the body of evidence we can provide for the standardization of the Quran, Jerome's Vulgate, and the Homeric poems. But again, the school of thought cannot. Even the allegation that the Bible was authored anew under the leadership of Ezra after the destruction of the temple in 586 BC was met with a swift rebuttal from Rabbi Solomon of Barcelona over the absurdity of such an assertion, given the consistency of the transmission of the Hebrew Bible. To paraphrase Rabbi Solomon, quote, "If someone should claim that all this had been added to the Hebrew Bible after the destruction of the first temple, every reasonable person and anyone having a brain in his head should reason whether it was possible to gather all the books of the Hebrew Bible in the possession of the Israelites, from the east to the west and from the north to the south, and to distort them in the same way without a single one escaping that'd be different from the other in a matter or in just one word," end quote. The answer is a conclusive no. Observe, the Jews at that time were in Babylon, Egypt, Yemen, Judea, and elsewhere throughout the known world. Additionally, as Rabbi Solomon points out, the Christian nations, who are much more learned in the Jewish scriptures than the Muslims, would have certainly discovered any such alterations, distortions, or amendments if this were the case. In fact, Jerome, who was well versed in the textual studies of both the Hebrew and Greek manuscript traditions of the Old Testament, did not uncover multiple authors of Isaiah. Consequently, neither did Origen or Eusebius. The multiple Isaiah authorship hypothesis was also not known to nearly all the scholars of Judaism, to include its earliest, Ben Siri, Josephus, and Philo. Even the reference in the Talmud is consistent with our theory given. Hezekiah was Isaiah's king and colleague who may have had many scribes throughout the years. In addition, the compilation under Hezekiah still places the written prophecy of Isaiah 140 years before the temple was demolished, thereby supporting our theory. The lone reference to the modern version of the divisionists' theory is a veiled comment made in the late Middle Ages, possibly crafted as a polemical response to the Christians' interpretation and advocacy of Isaiah chapter 53 against the Jewish communities. In conclusion, the alternative to the Jewish records is a convoluted naturalistic explanation that relies heavily on a subjective literary analysis, a line of argumentation that actually goes both ways, demonstrating the subjectivity of the method. Substantial physical evidence in the manuscript traditions, testimonial evidence to establish a historical reference, and a theoretical mechanism to account for the standardization of Isaiah throughout the Jewish synagogues are all absent in the divisionist theory of Isaiah. Ultimately, the divisionist theory of Isaiah rests on the flimsiest of foundations, which would not outweigh the direct and circumstantial evidence for our case. Thank you so much for listening to my argument. This is the end of our closing statement.
Thank you, Emma. I really appreciate that. Now we're going to move on to Dr. Kipp and Monger. And let's start. Who's going first? Is it you, Dr. Kipp?
Yeah, I am.
Awesome. Let me get my clock set and ready to rock and roll. Sharing screen. Everybody mute if you're not talking. And let me know when you're ready and I'll hit the start.
Okay, we're ready to go. Did the 8th century Hebrew prophet Isaiah ben Amoz predict the coming of Cyrus? Well, the answer to this question is no. In the biblical book commonly known as Isaiah, chapters 44, verse 28 and 45:1, the renowned Persian king Cyrus the Great is twice mentioned by name. Relevant passages were read to us kindly by Derek. Now, this is based on something that actually happened. In 539 BCE, Cyrus entered the city of Babylon, and the Persian Empire effectively stretched out to control most of the Mediterranean. The following year, Cyrus issued a decree providing for the return of exiled peoples to their homelands and the repatriation of regional cult places. Historians are generally agreed that this included the exiled Judeans in Babylon and resulted in some form of return and the reconstruction of the Temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. This passage in Isaiah appears to describe this event, and for centuries it has prompted scholars and careful readers of the Bible to reconsider traditional thoughts about the authorship and composition of the book of Isaiah. Both the rabbinic Jews and the early Christians inherited the idea that their book of Isaiah was a collection of prophecies, poems, and some historiography authored in the 8th century BCE by a man who served in the Jerusalem temple during the reigns of 4 Judean kings: Azariah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Ben Sira wrote in 180 BCE of Isaiah's predictive prowess, but with no mention of the Cyrus passages. But even if we are to grant the possibility of Isaiah's prophetic accuracy with or without the specific Cyrus text in mind, questions abound about how and why anyone in 8th century Jerusalem would even have understood these and numerous other portions of the book, which prominently feature imagery and information that could only be known as early as the 6th century. Contrary to what we read in the Cyrus text and throughout the later parts of Isaiah, where Jerusalem is deserted, the city in Isaiah's time experienced a population explosion as a result of the migration from refugees in the north, following the Assyrian victory over Samaria. Moreover, while the later texts depict a ruined and inactive temple, the temple of Yahweh in Isaiah's time was thriving and had been in continuous operation already for at least 200 years. Descriptions of a desolate city on the verge of repopulation or a temple in need of reconstruction from the very foundation are perplexing, even nonsensical, in this historical context. And this is the primary reason that scholars, beginning with Bernard Doom in the 19th century, began to carefully and successfully rethink the question of authorship of Isaiah and come to understand that this was a collection of multiple prophecies and texts written over several centuries and by different authors. While Isaiah ben Amoz might have composed or inspired the first half of the book, roughly chapters 1 to 33, where he is explicitly featured, the remainder of the text was clearly written by other anonymous authors who knew intimately about the events of the 6th and the 5th centuries. Generally speaking, scholars tend to think of chapters 40 to 55 as a collection of poems written around the time of Cyrus's edict in the 6th century and featuring the hopeful expectation of return from exile for the Judeans living in Babylon. Chapters 56 to 66 are thought to have been written later and presupposed a functional, reconstructed temple after 515 BCE. In what follows, I shall briefly review the evidence we have for the text of Isaiah, its composition, transmission, and preservation. After this, Dr. Monger will briefly discuss historical and literary methods and how and why scholars continue to treat Isaiah as a composite work of many voices over hundreds of years. The best, earliest manuscript copies of Isaiah date between 150 to 1 BCE and were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls between 1947 to 1953. But even for 100 years prior to this discovery, scholars were by and large convinced that Isaiah was composed of different parts written over centuries and collected together, all on the basis of internal literary features. Most notably, we are certain that the book contained at least 2 large inserted texts from no earlier than the 6th century BCE. The oracle against Moab in Isaiah 15 to 16 was also credited to the 6th century prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 48. The biographical section in chapters 36 to 39 was originally part of the Deuteronomistic history in 1 Samuel and 2 Kings and was copied verbatim from 2 Kings 18 to 21. Other passages are also possible or even probable later additions, such as the introduction to the whole collection of Isaiah in chapter 1, verses 24 to 27, and most notably, chapters 34 to 35, which function as a literary transition between the 8th century oracles and the 6th century promises. The so-called Little Apocalypse in Isaiah 24 to 27 likewise contains linguistic, thematic, and generic features that situate it much more comfortably in the Second Temple period. So, at the outset, we can see with abundant clarity that Isaiah was an anthology and that there were multiple hands at work in this text. Second, the 8th century prophet Isaiah ben Amoz is directly credited with only 3 oracles. And Isaiah's name appears only in the first half of the book, between chapters 1 to 39. Isaiah is not mentioned, nor identified as the source of the text for any point, generally assigned to the much later 2nd or 3rd Isaiah sections between chapters 40 to 66. Third, thematically speaking and in terms of content, there are considerable differences between all 3 of the main sections of the book. First Isaiah fits most comfortably within the 8th century Jerusalem and the socio-economic political situation there. Most of the 23 chapters address concerns of the Syro-Ephraimite War and the Assyrian invasion of Jerusalem in 734 BCE and the surrounding nations. Second Isaiah makes no reference at all to these events of the 8th century and is entirely focused on the state of the desolate city of Jerusalem, the ruined temple, and the exiled people of Judah, languishing in Babylon in 6th century BCE. The mention of the Persian king Cyrus and the recollection of Babylon's destruction would have made little sense to an 8th century audience who would not have known anything, not anything about Persia, and for who Babylon was no threat. Already by the 12th century CE, the great Jewish scholar Avraham ibn Ezra was positing that the second half of Isaiah had been written by another much later author on the basis of these same observations. Third Isaiah is very similar to second Isaiah. Jerusalem is depicted as ruined, and there is the same hopeful expectation for the return of Judean exiles from Babylon. Also, like second Isaiah, these events from the 6th century are depicted not as anticipated in the distant future, but rather as having already taken place. Unlike second Isaiah, however, in third Isaiah, the temple in Jerusalem appears to have been restored and is active. The best evidence, as mentioned, we have for the composition of any text are the manuscripts. Unfortunately, the earliest manuscripts we have of Isaiah date only as early as the mid-2nd century BCE, at least 100 years after the composition of even the latest portions of Isaiah. While there are a few good examples of manuscripts from this period containing all of Isaiah as we know it, importantly, there are many more of our oldest copies, our oldest manuscripts, which preserve only chapters 1 to 33 or chapters 40 to 66. For a number of these manuscripts, one of which you can see depicted here, this is 4Q Isaiah D, the surviving Scrabble evidence rather indisputably indicates that these were complete copies of only so-called first Isaiah or of second, third Isaiah. This clearly demonstrates that even as late as the Herodian period, the book of Isaiah was still collected in separate parts. And it shows that they most likely were originally composed separately. But even within the larger manuscripts containing all of our modern book of Isaiah, there are indications that this scroll was understood to be a composite work. The most famous and best preserved of all the Dead Sea Scrolls is a completely intact copy of Isaiah, which dates to the late 2nd century BCE, designated 1Q Isaiah A. It contains all 66 chapters of Isaiah, but this scroll also very interestingly is divided into 2 clear sections. The bisection of this scroll is an often overlooked and incredibly important detail insofar as the question of transmission is concerned. The division occurs in the center between chapters 33 to 34. The end of chapter 33 is followed by 3 open lines at the bottom of the column, which is also the end of a sheet. The beginning of chapter 34 appears at the start of the following sheet and in a new column. There are a handful of similar such breaks in other manuscripts from Qumran, and these all indicate the same thing, a transition between separate works, as seen here in 4Q Paleo Exodus 4Q Paleo Genesis Exodus L. We see it also in 4Q Leviticus Numbers A, and several times throughout the Minor Prophet scroll from Mudabat. According to James Davila, traditionally, about 4 lines would have been left blank prior to the beginning of a new book. There are 2 more Qumran manuscripts containing the 12 so-called minor prophets, 4Q12 C and G, which preserve clear transitions between the ends and the beginnings of separate compositions, and these appear even more discreetly than what we see in the aforementioned scrolls, including 1Q Isaiah A. Significantly, these particular texts attest to collections of individual prophets together in the same manuscripts, which is precisely what is illustrated by 1Q Isaiah A. I cannot stress the significance of this enough. In virtually every ancient example of texts from this same period, this type of division always and only means the same thing, a compositional shift from one independent work to another. And with this brief overview of the book of Isaiah and its constituent parts and the composition, manuscript, and scribal evidence for multiple authorship, I now turn this over to Dr. Monger, who will continue to discuss the historical and literary methods and their implications for the book of Isaiah. Whoops. Sorry about that.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kipp, for that introduction. What I want to do now is just look at a couple of issues related to methodology and the ways that we can discuss the date of a text. So I think methodology is a key factor in answering questions like these, because I'm not sure that we're ever going to agree on a theoretical level about what we're talking about. Theoretical questions about textual scholarship might be related to epistemology and ontology, how to define methods that we're using. Asking questions like, what can a text tell me about history? How can text be dated? What does a text say about God? But my personal scholarly position is that artifacts, including textual artifacts, are best studied within the historical context of their production and use. So whenever we attempt to move backwards in time from artifacts that we have, the weight of the burden of proof increases. So saying something about the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts in their historical setting is, in my opinion, a much more fruitful endeavor than saying something about the so-called origin of Isaiah. Because of this skepticism of stepping backwards into history, I'm extremely interested in the methods that are used and how they're justified and interpreted. And as far as I'm concerned, the primary interest of scholars is to develop robust methodologies that are testable and repeatable for any text, and not just for text within a single religious canon. So what I'm discussing here could be used on any range of texts, though I am exemplifying it through Isaiah. So one of the biggest challenges in doing this work in general is that we have to take into use a variety of methods in order to say anything at all. We have to deal with manuscripts. We have to discuss textual and linguistic details. We have to examine historical references. We have to take into account scribal practices and compositional techniques of antiquity. We also have to disentangle all of this from our own presuppositions about writing and authorship. So a common method for dating a text would be to establish limits for the possible writing of the text by finding its earliest secured witness on the one hand and the latest possible time of writing on the other. So using the methods from manuscript studies and paleography, Kipp has already discussed the manuscript evidence for Isaiah, and we can draw two conclusions based on that. One, Isaiah was copied in what is now the canonical length during the 2nd century BCE. And two, Isaiah was also copied in smaller parts and sections during the 2nd century BCE, including the divisions of, say, 1 to 33 and the later portion of the book. This means that in the 2nd century BCE, we have a terminus antiquem, also a time before which Isaiah must have been written. So basically, we could stop there. Isaiah must have been written before the mid-2nd century BCE. Everything else means projecting meaning into a time previous to the copying of the existing manuscripts. That makes it tenuous, and it requires different methods. So one way to do this, and that scholars generally would use, is to find datable historical events or features described or alluded to in the text so that we can know the latest possible time in which a text was written. So the terminus postquem. For Isaiah, there are numerous events that we could point to. The mention of Cyrus the Great is what we're talking about today, is also the most well-known of those. And historians would then say that the knowledge of this in the text says that the text was written after, say, 540 BCE. So even if we don't use this reference, though, there are numerous texts that describe late exilic or post-exilic contexts in the book of Isaiah such as Judeans having returned to Jerusalem from the exile, which require a 6th century date or later. But when exactly during this period we want to put the date of Isaiah is very difficult and requires a much more detailed analysis than I think would be fruitful here. So I'd rather turn to the linguistic evidence. This is also a very tricky endeavor and raises pretty much just as many questions as it answers. But in general terms, we can say that as the language evolves, there are certain features that become more prominent and certain features which fall into disuse. This linguistic drift may be visible in texts, but is generally limited to establishing a later date for a text, not an earlier one. In other words, the presence of features that only appear in late biblical Hebrew is a strong indication of a text being late, but the absence of late features does not necessarily indicate an early text. An additional problem here is the well-known phenomena of archaism or classicisms, where a later writer uses an earlier style in order to mimic it or to appear earlier. But I'm not going to go into too many details here, but I want to actually use a quote from a recent book on linguistic dating of the Hebrew Bible by Ron Handel and Jan Justen. After First Isaiah, brought to closure with the historical chapters paralleling Kings, comes a collection of prophetic texts reflecting a much later age. The linguistic differences between the two parts of the book leap to the eye. A famous example occurs in the two passages announcing how the idyllic future peace will reign among the animals. Isaiah 11:6 uses the adverb yachdav, together, but Isaiah 65:25 substitutes the adverbial phrase ke'echad, together or as one. The former is typical of classical biblical Hebrew, and the latter is a calque from the Aramaic, never found in classical biblical Hebrew, but well attested in late biblical Hebrew. There are more instances. Isaiah 40-66 has around 30 elements characteristic of late biblical Hebrew. Some of these features include finite verbs with pronominal suffixes, the use of infinitive absolute in the place of finite verbs, the prominence of certain verb conjugations that statistically are just higher in the latter part of Isaiah than former, and all this points to a later date for the latter half of the book. Some more telling evidence is the presence of lexemes and loanwords that are simply not in use in earlier periods. We have a number of Aramaic words that are loaned into Hebrew. We have developments of Hebrew verbs, specific Hebrew nouns and phrases that only come into use in the Persian period and that are found in Isaiah 40-66. In other words, there are multiple pieces of evidence. There are multiple methods that can be used to establish evidence from a variety of angles that all point to material in Isaiah coming from the period after 540 BCE. And we could stop there if we wanted to and paint a picture about the text of Cyrus coming after the fact, not 150 or 200 years earlier. And many scholars do indeed now focus on the unity of the book of Isaiah, the fact that there are literary connections between all the parts of the book, and instead of focusing on these earlier divisions. In fact, I know quite a few scholars who thinks that these kind of reconstructions are just plain stupid, but it's because the text as we have it bears such a clear stamp of the Persian period and fits so perfectly for the people who were returned from the exile. But I do think there are good reasons to allow ourselves to ask whether it was made up of component parts. But this would mean then adding even more methods that, you know, maybe if we have time later, we can get into the reconstruction of an earlier phase of Isaiah than the received text. But I hope this kind of serves to show some of the methodologies, some of the angles that historical scholars are using. But in the end, what we can be sure of is that Isaiah was being transmitted both in its canonical form and in smaller pieces in the second century BCE. Other than that, we are all just working through different methodological lenses. Thank you.
Timing was perfect on that. I really appreciate it. I didn't want to have to interrupt. So now we're going to rebuttals.
I think we got lucky.
Yeah, you really did get lucky. So we're going to go back with rebuttals. And did you say you wanted Emma to go first, Jonathan?
Yes, I'll be going first.
Awesome. So we'll let you go first, and I'm going to give 8 minutes per side, no more than 8 minutes. And you can start when you're ready. I'm going to pop off the screen when you're ready.
All right.
Yeah, and if you could just tell me, Derek, how much time we have after she's done, I'll just take the rest of that time.
I will private chat on the side any time remaining.
Okay. According to Dr. Richard Carrier, quote, lay people need to be able to evaluate the argumentative and evidential value of expert opinion, and that includes a consensus of expert opinion. They need to be able to tell when that value has when that has value, when it does not, and how much value it has, without themselves being experts. Let's first take under advisement the literary arguments proposed by both the divisionists and conservatives for the book of Isaiah in assessing the evidential value for its respective cases. According to James Smart, a divisionist who summed up the situation on both sides of the issues, he wrote, quote, an honest recognition of the meagerness of the evidence demands of us a suspension of judgment. Yet one commentator after another has proceeded to base his interpretations upon assumptions that have rested on the flimsiest of foundations, end quote. Then we have a quote from another divisionist scholar, Otto Eisfeld, who admits that there are many common features, both in ideas and in linguistic usage, between chapters 40 and chapter 55 in Isaiah, and chapter 56 and 66 through 66, that is also admitted by those who do not believe in and identify of the compilers of the two sections. The differences of opinions on this question itself suggests that the arguments adduced to decide it are ambiguous and can hence be applied in opposite ways. As a layperson, I can easily deduce from this information that there is a little evidentiary value for a literary case to be made on either side, given the lack of support for the assumptions and the inconclusive interpretation that can be made for the same piece of evidence. The byproduct of such a flaw in the methodology is that it leads to faulty conclusions. Take the statistical linguistic analysis conducted under Yehuda Radeh, a professor of Jewish studies and Hebrew at the Israel Institute of Technology. He independently concluded that the book of Isaiah was written by multiple authors. His assumption was that a difference in the usage of one type of word, such as war terminology, from one section or prophecy to another was an indication of a difference in authorship. However, a study was conducted at BYU, which applied Yehuda Radeh's procedures to a known text of the British essayist and historian Thomas Carlyle. The reports of that study at BYU was a false conclusion that part of Thomas Carlyle's text was written by another author. While I'm not here to argue the merits of either study, it does seem reflective of the problems indicated by both Smart and Eisfeld's observations in this field as a whole. From my perspective, I can certainly see some evidentiary value in the study of linguistics, as evidenced by the work of Lorenzo Valla, who exposed the donation of Constantine as a forgery, yet it can't make up the totality of one's case with respect to our discussion of Isaiah, given the array of variables that have to be considered. So that's my arguments for the rebuttal, and I believe I had my time said 3 minutes and 23 seconds, so I'll go ahead and leave Mr. Sheffield to take up.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Once again, Matthew and Kipp, thank you for your opening. One of the things that we'll probably be able to pursue a little longer on is this idea of a historical reference. While in your openings, you did make reference to specific periods or periods under the Persian regime and afterwards, I'm still looking for a mechanism. I'm looking for an Ezra. And even in the case of Ezra, who may have had some ability, at least in Jerusalem, to orchestrate some type of evidence, how effective would he have been able to get that over in Babylon or in Egypt? And it's also given that we're looking at the extant manuscript traditions that have come down, and while we have seen a lot of apocryphal work or writings come in, we just don't see that for the book of Isaiah. As Emma brought up in her opening, we see additional works attributed to Daniel, additional sections in Daniel. We have the Greek manuscript traditions and the Septuagint, and all this stuff seemed to find its way into those texts, just not into the Orthodox Jewish canon. So why don't we see this? And why do we see this everywhere else when we look at ancient texts? Now, in terms of the linguistic styles, some of the questions I have on my mind, we do know from Jeremiah that he did use Baruch. Now, while Jeremiah does say he did dictate it, whose style was it being written in? Was it written in Baruch's? Was it written in Jeremiah's? How do we tell that from a linguistic analysis unless we have an interpreter or a Jerome equivalent to give us information on his methodology? Jerome's a good example in the sense that we find in many of his letters his approach to the text, so we can find out information or lay the basis for the foundation on what we're actually looking at. And additionally, how do we account for any modernization that may have taken place in the Hebrew text throughout the years? So while we're looking at something that may be more modernized this many years into the future, how do we know what we're looking at now is not the same thing that was originally written in the sense of modernization? The example I refer to this is while the Homeric texts were put together, or at least evidence supports it, at the time of Pisistratus, it did go through a sort of editing process at Alexandria in their scholars. So if I'm looking at that text from a linguistic style, will it trace back to Pisistratus' time, or was it modernized by those scholars at the Library of Alexandria, which will not give us an effective dating to trace that text back? So obviously there's lots of questions on how much value do we place on the literary analysis. An analysis that Emma brought up can go both ways. And given the support that we would expect to see in other cases where known amendments may have happened, especially if we look at the last 12 verses of Mark, we do see, as meager as it is, some trace evidence indicating such an amendment taking place. And our big concern is, why don't we see this in the manuscript traditions, in the Greek or the Syriac or the Hebrew, such a division of Isaiah coming down? With that, I will cede my time back over to Matthew and Kipp.
Your timing was perfect. And when you get started, either one of you wants to go first, I will start it.
All right, I'm in. So thank you both very much for your very well thought out and well presented presentations. I'm definitely impressed by the level of engagement and speaking ability. You blew us out of the water. So I'm very, very happy that we could be part of this. I think I'm going to leave Kipp for the manuscript stuff, for the Isaiah stuff to have a crack at that. But what I want to focus on here is the idea that it is the most reasonable explanation that, as Jonathan said, that Cyrus was presented with a copy of Isaiah and then made a decision to enact the prophecy. Because I think what it's exactly what I'm getting at when I go into methodology is that we can discuss methodologies up and down, and finding faults in methodologies and uncertainties is what strengthens the methodology and makes it stronger and better for the future. And what I don't see in reconstructing this is any other methodology than relying on Josephus. Because basically that's the source, as I understand it, is because Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews does say that Isaiah was read by Cyrus and then Cyrus decided to enact it. And so if that's the case, then it's also interesting that Josephus does the same thing with Alexander the Great, that the Jews are saved and allowed to survive because he reads the book of Daniel or something. And Jonathan knows a bit more about this than I do, I think. I know he's debated it. And I want us to think about why we would accept that as truth in a historical sense, because I, as a historian, wouldn't. What I see is that it's precisely the fact that Josephus writes it that makes it very, very fishy. Josephus is a friend of the Roman emperor. He is first he's a captive, and then he's a translator or a slave or something, and then he's freed, but he has contact with the Roman elite, and Josephus envisions himself as this person that is giving the history of the Jews to the Roman elite. And he is basically giving the scriptures of the Jews to the Roman emperor in the same way as he pictures someone giving Isaiah to the Persian king, in the same way as he pictures someone giving it to the Greek Alexander the Great. And in this literary trope, we don't see historical detail. What we see is rhetoric. And so Josephus is playing a part of saying, let's spare the Jews again. We are in the period between 70 AD and 135. So this is the time when there's the most pressure on the Jews by the Romans, right? We have this scary time between the destruction of the temple and the looting of Jerusalem, and then the final destruction in 135 at Bar Kokhba. And so this is a time when I think it's very clear that Josephus is playing a rhetorical role. And so I don't think that trusting that as a historical source and then saying that Occam's razor is then valid because that's the easiest explanation bears historical weight. And given that I don't see other historical reasons to think that the Jews meant anything to the Persians, this tiny group of people that's not mentioned in the Cyrus cylinder, which I'm sure we'll get back to later, they're not mentioned in other historical records as being so important that the king went out and said, hey, you guys, I'm taking care of you in this way. It's all from Jewish history that they're imagining themselves into the great empire, not the empire imagining their history being centered around the Jews. So with that, let Kipp take over.
Hello.
Go ahead, Kipp. You were muted for a second. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. How much time do I have, Derek?
About 4 minutes.
Okay. So I echo Matt's thoughts. I thought you guys both did a terrific job, and I particularly wanted to say, I'm impressed that that you delved into the manuscripts a little bit, because this is challenging. It's not especially straightforward, and while you ought to be commended for tackling this, there's ways in which we look at the manuscripts, which can be complicated, and not always entirely straightforward at a lay level. I thought it was interesting that both of us zeroed in on the one copy of Isaiah, the so-called Great Isaiah Scroll, and this is a manuscript that has special affinity for me because I worked on this a little bit in 2005 when Peter Flint and Eugene Ulrich were in the process of doing their studies for their publication of it. So when we talked about the break between chapters 33 to 34, your presentation tended to focus on comparing this manuscript with other later medieval copies, as well as with later Christian traditions in terms of handling texts and in terms of the Christian manuscript tradition itself. Dealing with the Christian manuscripts is problematic on several levels, not least of which the fact that we have like 5,000 Greek manuscripts, several dating to within, a couple hundred years of the texts themselves. For the entirety of the Hebrew canon, we have literally just hundreds from the early period, and almost all of which are already deeply immersed within a long-standing manuscript tradition. So when it comes to making doing our work within the manuscripts, it's very important to do two things: stick with the tradition that we're working in, and stick with the stuff that's definitely the earliest. So while there are similar style breaks in things like Sinaiticus, text of visions, this is not the case for any of the early Jewish manuscripts from the Second Temple period. In virtually all of them, these kind of breaks always universally indicate compositional divisions, as I suggested. And in addition to what I didn't get a chance to get into are the numerous scribal notations throughout 1Q Isaiah A. These are called paragraphoi, and there's several different types. I think there's nearly 100 different scribal notations in just this one manuscript. And there's one that seems fairly significant. This is something that scholars are still working through, trying to figure out what most of these mean. But there's one mark that appears like a line with a circle on the top. There's 6 instances throughout within the Isaiah scroll, and virtually all of them are contained in the second half. And this is what we would identify after chapter 33, beginning in chapter 34. Significantly, several of these marks correspond to divisions that scholars had already kind of imagined for the book of Isaiah. These appear at the beginning of the biographical section in chapter 36, and then at the beginning of Second Isaiah in so-called Second Isaiah in chapter 40. Okay, and then in the design section in chapter 60. So thanks.
Sorry to cut you off. Gotta keep it strict.
No, we can get into more of this as we go.
Yeah, and you will. I'm going to be popping off the screen. I'm going to give a 40-minute cross-examination. What we'd like to do, as we discussed before the debate, is allow you one question at a time. That way we're not dodging it. If you don't know the answer, you don't know the answer. Get it. But one question at a time. One team asks the other has to answer. Throw your question back at the next team and kind of go back and forth, almost like a dialogue. I don't think I'll need to stay on here babysitting and making sure that things are going smooth, but I will pop on if I feel like I need to interject at all. So I'm setting the time for 40 minutes. And Jonathan, since you were the one who organized the whole thing initially, who do you want to go first?
I guess Emma can ask the first question. She's new, even though she's been participating in debates for a while. So if
it shows,
ladies first.
You just want to win. That's why. Okay, I'm going to back out, and then when Emma starts, I'll start our time.
Okay. This question is for either of you guys to answer. Given Jerome's scholarship in the Greek and Hebrew manuscript traditions of the Old Testament and his ability to inspect the data at an early period in history, whereby he was able to identify amendments in Esther, Daniel, and other works in the Orthodox Hebrew canon, essentially my question is, if there is weight to your theory on Isaiah, why wouldn't someone as experienced as Jerome uncover it?
Well,
are you going to go, or do you want me to go?
let me just just throw in a caveat there, because I don't care if 1, 2, or 3 people wrote Isaiah. Like I think there's reason to think that there are traditions in Isaiah that are earlier than the Persian period, because they make most sense in 8th century Jerusalem. But the book as we have it reflects a Persian period time. like that. And so like I don't like I agree that there is literary unity, and I agree that there are parts that kind of flow from one part to the other, which is the product of it being put together well. So the whole documentary idea, like Doom's idea that there's 1 to 39 and then there's 40 to 55 and then there's 56 to 66, I don't buy that, and especially not in a documentarian way. And so like just so you know what, like I'm not going to take that position. And I'm very happy to talk about the received text as a reasonable unity. Like I don't have a problem with that. But then I want to start with that as a Persian period text. And then we can work backwards and say, I think this stuff about the Syro-Ephraimite War makes a lot more sense in 8th century Jerusalem than it does in Persian period Jerusalem. So then I say, yeah, so Jerome didn't see a problem with this. That doesn't bother me at all, actually. Kipp, okay. Do you want to add to that?
I think I would just add to that I mean, this is what sort of one of the problems I was just getting to. Jerome is writing in the 4th century, and he's already, it's 4th century, isn't it? I don't know. That's
383.
Yeah. So he's, I mean, we're already talking about hundreds of years of Christian tradition having developed up to this point. It's very unlikely, based on what we know about the life of manuscripts. And this is something that there's been a good deal of study into. Milet and Popovich has produced a very nice article about the life of manuscripts of within Jewish scribal culture. You're talking about probably 200 years of use for an individual manuscript before it has to be basically discarded and recopied. So what Jerome is dealing with are manuscripts that have already undergone an extensive development within the scribal culture, already much later, much farther along the line than even the surviving manuscripts that we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, to say nothing of what they inherited from the as far back as the Persian period. And one of the frustrating things here with this whole with doing this kind of research is the fact that we have nothing. Like we have nothing in terms of manuscript evidence that predates the 3rd century. So scholars are continuing to build their models based on like these early texts that they have, but it's imperfect and it's pretty messy. But what we can see is that there is this flow towards a calcification of text, in particular after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem.
So you guys are going to want to ask a question back. I just want to poke in and make sure that you're turning to them.
Yeah, sure. I guess maybe I'll start, and I guess I'm interested to know, maybe at the outset, we talked about 1Q Isaiah A. I'm interested to know from you guys how you I guess reconstruct the 4Q Isaiah manuscripts in accordance with your theory that this was always a unified composition that was transmitted as such through early Jewish history.
And I'll probably take this, even though I'm not as familiar on the manuscript itself, Kipp. One of the things I do think about when I think about the Dead Sea Scrolls is the provenance of them. So looking at that tradition independently, to not to saying it doesn't have value, the question is, which tradition does it represent? We know there was lots of wars in that time. People were running off to the caves. here's what we've been left. And even though it does, there's a lot of consistency between the Masoretic text tradition and that one. I still have to look at that is still one piece of evidence. We are doing a sort of internal discussion on it. It's the same thing how I'd probably look at it from Vaticanus and Sinaiticus as being an independent tradition that maybe has some close resemblances, but still doesn't look like the rest of the tradition here. And am I going to base my whole thesis, on these observations just from that text without any supporting information? So, ideally, if what I'd hope to see with that manuscript, or we had any evidence that suggested, like in the notations, I know you spoke about this before, maybe you can give some feedback. Is there anything that indicates in the annotations or comments that, hey, this was a separate section that belonged to a different time that was written by another person? But that's what I'm thinking. So hopefully I answered that to the best of my ability, given it's not my expert on there.
Is that a question for us at the end?
No, that's not a question. That's what I'm thinking.
Because I could just answer. Am I allowed to do this, Derek? Sorry.
Look, it's really a matter of what you're all okay with. If you want to make a brief response and then just hand it over. I don't know. Did Emma want to add anything to that, or did you feel confident?
Yeah, I'm going to let Mr. Sheffield answer that. And honestly, my knowledge is, I need to learn a lot. And so I might not have a lot to share on these more of the literary questions. But yeah, I think Mr. Sheffield did a good job answering that.
So if you want to respond to that, Kipp, and then let Jonathan and Emma ask you a question back, or your team a question.
So I think I would just say, and I'm going to continue to come back to this. We have numerous examples of they're right there in the scrolls where you have a complete copy of, the second half of Isaiah just on its own. You've got a complete copy of the first half of Isaiah all on its own. And as arcane as we might imagine the community to be that collected the Dead Sea Scrolls or copied them, and there's a lot of scholarship that suggests that this was actually much more reflective of traditional Jewish scribal practices. This is the evidence that we have. I don't know. So that's unless Matthew wants to add anything, maybe you guys you have another question for us, because I think that was
I would just like to throw in there that I understand, Jonathan, why you haven't come across this, because
that's fair. Yeah,
I think Kipp and I are two of the people that think most in this direction. There's not a ton of people that have done and published the research collecting what scrolls contain which portions of the books. And in a lot of the research, and a lot of or let me say, not in the research, but in the publications that then digest the research to a Christian audience, pretty much every time you read about it, it's going to say there are 27 copies of Isaiah among the Dead Sea Scrolls, or whatever it is, and 33 of the Psalms, and it's going to give you numbers, and it's going to call them copies. But that is not true. There are not complete copies for every manuscript that receives an identification among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So when we talk about 1Q Isaiah, the Great Isaiah Scroll, that's a complete copy, and it's lovely, and everybody's happy. But when we talk about 4Q 55, it has from Isaiah 1 to 23 That's as far as the extent goes that we're able to see. We have material reasons to believe that it could not have extended beyond chapter 30 or 33. So it's just the limits of how big scrolls were in antiquity tell us this. In 1Q or 4Q 55, that's same thing. It starts in 46, the evidence we have, and then goes through 58. So we have like these things, and the limits of it would place it perfectly within either starting at 34, 36, or 40. But you would not have had room for the entire book of Isaiah. And this goes on and on and on. And this is one of those things that Kipp and I will hopefully eventually publish in a scholarly journal that you can read about. But like, it's just not out there. And so like, that is something that is not a way that the scholarship has been presented to the public, is not by collecting things and saying, here is what we think is the actual limits of this scroll. Even though in the publications, if you really go look at them, a lot of times there'll be a sentence that says, this was probably not a complete copy of the book. Like, so it was there, but just scholars today are starting to turn that evidence into published research. So it's a tough thing to know.
Yeah. No, and thank you for sharing that. And part of this is the learning side of it as well, getting exposure from both your scholarship and the amount of research. I think I'll for my next question, just because I think this is an interesting discussion around the political reality of the Persian period. And either Matthew or Kipp, or probably more geared to Matthew, since he did engage it on the rebuttal. One of the things I want that interests me when I put together this thesis on Cyrus is I looked at a number of factors. Obviously, I'm never saying that we just go with one source. Obviously, I'm going to take that document, since in a court, I will take the evidence that's presented. The other thing is the political reality of the time. So one of the things that interests me when I read Xenophon many years ago, and then got to catch back on him, is Cyrus's institution of the king's eyes and ears. And obviously, I understand from a political standpoint the importance of having information, even today. Now, obviously, Cyrus was rewarding people liberally to get information to protect his interests and the interests of the Persian Empire. Now, the Jews did not only have a number of enemies, given what was happening there, but my question to you, and get your thoughts on this, is while I think there is some agreement, or hopefully, that this proclamation was published sometime in the Persian period after Cyrus, how would have such a report, whether the heralds were going around Jerusalem and promoting this, or it was being read throughout the synagogues? Xenophon does say the eyes and ears were everywhere. Everyone was afraid. Anything said, such a report would be deemed as mocking Cyrus. And certainly the enemies of the Jews would have used it to further their case to nullify the permit. So I just want to get some of your thoughts on that, Matthew.
So there was, I feel like there are several things there that need to be addressed. So, so let me just take the one thing that I feel like is glaring that I need to say. Like, I don't know if we can talk about synagogues. Like, I think that's probably off the table. So, like, the idea of the Jewish synagogue is a later concept. And
or
so I'm not,
or community, I guess. Or
sure. I mean, if you like the places where Jews were gathering, that's fine. We'll just say like so there's a couple of things I want to kind of look at there. One would be just like I think that So what you're asking us to do is to talk about historical probabilities or plausibilities. I feel like you're saying it's more probable that Cyrus knew about Isaiah and read Isaiah than that the Jews knew about a proclamation to send them home. Is that what you're saying? I'm not sure what the problem is.
Well, so what I'm saying is that Cyrus had all these spies all throughout the areas that were reporting back. Okay. And if the Jews were just so enthralled by his philanthropy that they're like, hey, we're just going to throw it into the text. This is our divine revelation to our people. How such a report would have been viewed in the Persian Empire, which would have seemed to be mocking the king. Our God predicted you, like, hey. How?
Yeah, now I see where you're going with that. Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess I think two things automatically right there. One, I think I don't agree that it's mocking. Like I would say that, yeah. So if that report were to go back to an emperor and all that, and if you accept that the eyes and ears would be in Jerusalem or would be wherever and sending this back, I think that what it is an affirmation that it worked. Like it's literally a confirmation that the edict of Cyrus was successful, because not only are the people going back and getting out of Babylon and not there as a political threat in Babylon anymore, the people are saying, this king did it. We are thrilled. He made everything better. He's even divinely sent. This is like, how much better could it be? Like, this is awesome. He's literally our Messiah. This is great. And so I think that, like, if I'm going to imagine, like you are, the political reality, I don't see that one case is stronger than, I don't see that your case is stronger anyway than a reading of it that it will be read as a great thing. But my bigger problem, or my bigger problem with that whole situation is just that I think that there is a tendency to over-evaluate the importance of the Jews within the Persian Empire in your whole argumentation. I don't think that Cyrus gave a flying squirrel about it. I don't think it. I mean, I don't see what impact it would have whether the Jews that were returned thought that Cyrus did it because he was sent by God, or whether, I just don't see how the value is in saying that they were so great. Yes, of course, in the Jewish picture, this is a massive event. And this is why it should be read the opposite way, right? This is why saying, how do we fit into the great things that are happening in the empire is a very relevant reading of this portion of Isaiah. But reading the empire is saying, here is this tiny group of people that are so important. That isn't like, it doesn't play out. And so when we see that this is literally a political reality, that Cyrus was allowing people to go home, and it was a political reality that they were allowed to rebuild their temples, and it was a political reality that he wanted to set up satrapies around the empire and govern it in a different way than the Babylonians did, to imagine that the Jewish people that returned imagined themselves and wrote this story of the reestablishment into that grand scale with themselves at the center is perfectly normal. And so it's not I think that covers the historical political reality in a better way, to read it as a response to the Persian rather than as a prediction of it.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. I guess Kipp or Matthew.
Yeah, you turn around and give them a question back.
You go, Matthew.
Oh boy. So I mean, yeah, you threw Xenophon at me right there, because that was what I was going to ask you about, actually. But then so I can just kind of go to the next thing I was wondering about. So I think for Emma, so I mean, I really feel like you engaged with this forensic methodology, and it feels kind of overwhelming to be on the other side of the witness stand from that sort of logic. But I want to challenge you a bit, or ask you if you can explain how anything else after you said there's no evidence, because you said there's no testimonials and there's no, what's the other thing? There's testimonial and then there's the other thing. I'm sorry, I'm not good at forensics, but you said there's no evidence, and so you say we have no evidence for the case, and so there's nothing we can really do. And then I'm just wondering then, how would you build up that other side of what is the argument for then saying that Isaiah is 8th century and that this is a prophecy, if there is also no evidence for it being 6th century, written by several people? Like, what is the evidence for historical dating that you're kind of arguing for, that's not also thrown out by throwing out our evidence of authorship? Like, what methods are left, or what evidence is left?
I guess what I was specifically talking about, and I developed this in my speech, is that a similar debate we could have is the long ending of Mark. And in that debate, there are a couple manuscripts that don't have that ending chapter or those ending verses. And that would be an example you could provide of this manuscript doesn't have it. Therefore, maybe we could make the conclusion that it was added in some cases, and this was simply a case where it was neglected to be added. And so when I was making that assumption or making that analogy, essentially that could be a type of evidence, a type of thing you could present. Look at these manuscripts. They don't have these last verses. And I feel like this debate for Isaiah, and again, you know a lot more than I do, but it feels more of a in-depth literary analysis. And I don't see as much evidence of saying, oh, well, in this case, we have this manuscript that are numerous cases where they don't have these specific chapters of Isaiah, which is, in my preference, a weaker case than what can be substantiated in the Mark 16 debate, were we to have that debate. So that was essentially my argument, and I apologize if I didn't answer that sufficiently. But yeah.
I mean, and I would agree with you that that is a much more robust case. And this is the fault. This is, I guess, just a problem with the way scholarship progresses and the way that stuff that happens within the academia, filters out and trickles down at a snail's pace into like the lay discussions, because it's frustrating that we do have the manuscripts, as mentioned now, from Qumran, which show these types, exactly what you're looking for. We've got that. We've got manuscripts that are exclusively just first half or second half of Isaiah. But the problem here is that this isn't something that anybody knows, because for various reasons, this is not the kind of information that gets out there, ahead of something like the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is a tremendous document. And because it's such a tremendous document, it tends to monopolize the entire public imagination about not just this text, but I think, the entire collection of Dead Sea Scrolls. And as a result of that, there's so much more information that's, there, which unfortunately lay people never get access to or even see. Yeah. So sorry, that's just my little rant. But
if you want to ask a question back, Emma or Jonathan, to them.
I guess I have a question kind of in relation to this, and I mentioned this in my speech about how 2nd, 3rd Isaiah could have been added. Do you guys have a proposed theoretical mechanism to explain how it would have been added on such a broad scale, because we don't have examples, as I said in the Mark 16 debate, where, oh, we have this manuscript that doesn't have it. Do you have a proposed mechanism to explain how those additional portions of Isaiah could have been added?
So I mean, there's a couple ways we can go here. I mean, something that is becoming much more common now within scholarship. I know this is a direction that Matthew in particular thinks is that Isaiah really is a product of the Persian period. That the whole thing is basically put together then. So there never was, according to this model, there never was really, a point in time when all of a sudden somebody went, oh, let's just add all this new information to this long existent text. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at this is by using an analogous, similar sort of text from within the Jewish canon, and that's the Minor Prophets scroll. What we call the 12 so-called minor prophets was, for as long as we can see through the manuscript evidence, an anthology of texts that were all collected together at the same time. And I think you can approach the development of the book of Isaiah in similar terms, as a collection of multiple prophecies, multiple pieces of writing that were collected together for a very long period of time. And I'm used with this idea before that early on, it's quite plausible that nobody ever even imagined the second half of the second, third Isaiah as anything other than anonymous prophecies that were part of the same sort of text, and collected together with it. And then over time, it all just kind of got subsumed under the authorship of Isaiah, just because he happens to be the most prominent figure throughout the whole manuscript. As I mentioned, the whole text is credited, or I should say, in our modern imagination, the entire text is credited to Isaiah. And this is by virtue of the introduction, which most scholars consider to be a late addition, at the end of this redactional process. And then throughout the text itself, you've got some biographical material dealing with Isaiah in chapters 7 through 9, and then in 36 to 39. But after that, only 3 oracles are explicitly assigned to him. Virtually everything else is, just a general oracle of Yahweh, or a text that really is not provided any authorship. I don't know. Do you have anything to add to that, Matthew?
Yeah, because I just think that it's actually wrong to say that we don't have analogies, because the Pentateuch is an analogy for this. The Deuteronomistic history is also an analogy for this. We have other works that belong to the Jewish canon that, given modern scrutiny, very clearly have sources or have parts that come from very different periods that make sense if we have a developing text rather than a singular text written at a certain point in time. And whether we want to talk about sources and redaction, or we want to talk about a literary kernel that grows and things like that, that we can debate, and that we'll never know, and now that's what that's what scholars live for, is the fact that we can find one thing and we can argue it until our deathbed, and that's great. But we do see that, and I think that the story from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings is a great example of this, because there are definitely older source materials in there, like otherwise a lot of the things that are being written wouldn't make sense. But there's also obviously a lot of later material, and the whole thing was put together after the events of the 2 Kings. So it's a late text that uses things, and so it's obviously composite. It's obviously brought together by someone with an agenda to make it into a singular, but it's not a problem. And then we have First and Second Chronicles, which literally just rewrites that story, right? And so we know the source for it, even though Chronicles presents itself as a singular. It uses sources and it makes reference to sources, and it's there. But what I really want to say is that a best example, and this is the one I know the best because it's what I do, is the Book of Jubilees, because the Book of Jubilees is also, it's a rewriting of the Book of Genesis and beginning of Exodus, and scholars basically fight over the most ridiculous question of semantics when we discuss authorship, because all we're really trying to decide is at what point do we call it the Book of Jubilees. Because we all agree that there are earlier sources. We all agree that somebody came in and redacted those sources and made a chronology and made a whole system out of it. And then at some point that basically gets solidified. But the question is just when. And because Jubilees is a 2nd century BC or 1st century BC book, we have access to manuscripts that show it in real time. But with Isaiah, we just simply don't have that process documented, and so I think like we have a lot of analogies and we have a lot of theoretical models that help us understand how composition was happening actually in Jewish antiquity, but we just simply don't have the manuscripts. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
How much time do we have left?
Jonathan, go ahead. 8 minutes.
Okay.
We can't hear you, man.
Yeah, man.
Sorry about that. So this is for both Matthew and Kipp. Just because discussions going down this area, so I just want to get some of your thoughts on this. One thing I find in some of the Jewish history that is kind of interesting. Obviously, if we look at the Book of Psalms, in the Talmud, we do see that David, did compile works from previous generations in compiling that particular work. I think that the Talmud is pretty honest about, Joshua finishing up the work of Deuteronomy. We do see even with Chronicles, obviously Nehemiah taking over for Ezra. Even with the book of Joshua, we do have, Aaron's son and Pinhas completing the rest of the book for him. They're pretty honest also about the book of Samuel with Nathan the prophet, finishing up the work after he died. And we do see where either in the book of Psalms, Chronicles, and these other works where they are taking compilations from previous periods. I think Psalms is a good example where they do that. The one question I have is, while they do have that reference to under Hezekiah, his colleagues, indicating possibly Isaiah, it does give us a definite period when it was put in. And then, scribes, Isaiah may have lived for a long time. He would have had possibly many scribes over the years. Once they lose their eyesight, you need someone else to come in and start doing it for you. But what we see with Samuel, with Psalms, with Joshua, with Deuteronomy, where they do tell you, hey, people came in and they added on, they finished it up, they did this work. What are some of your thoughts, given both of you, especially on Jubilees, because that is very interesting. So you may have more to add, Matthew, on this. But why don't we see such information apart from what we see with Ibn Ezra quoting a reference in the Middle Ages to that type of compilation with Isaiah over a period of time?
So I'll start with the reference to Hezekiah and the Babylonian Talmud, just because I understand that actually is a reference that Hezekiah wrote it or had it written. And so I think there's, yeah. So if we're going for authorship there's something weird in that. But I think we have to just like take a step back and then ask ourselves about the language you're using to describe the Babylonian Talmud and the references found therein. You're saying, that they were honest about it being David compiled, and they were honest about Samuel, and honest, and I would just I would say these are traditions from the first half of the first millennium after Christ. Like we're talking about traditions very far removed from the text that are written in order to answer the problems that they already saw. So this is a pre-critical answer to the questions that contemporary scholars answer in a different way. And the methodology that's being used is to say, what person that we know from the text could we substantiate could have continued on that tradition? Right. And so when they're saying that, okay, Joshua could have written the end of the Deuteronomy, well, sure, whatever. But the really interesting thing is the fact that they understood that Moses couldn't have written the end of the Torah. Right. They understood that Samuel couldn't have written the books of Samuel. They understood that David, he couldn't have written all the Psalms. And they're saying, what do we do with this? How do we answer these questions? And they're going about it in the most critical way they know how, according to their methodologies, which is look to the text. And they're answering it text internally. And now with that, contemporary scholarship looks in different ways at it is not worse. So I don't think that we can give more weight to a text internal Jewish Talmudic answer. What that answer tells us is how they work and how they answer the question at the time, but it doesn't tell us anything about the truth of how the books were made.
If I could just quickly add to that too, the Psalms is a really good example here because this is a collection of texts where the authorial attributions to David are actually expansive over time. And we see this, it increases from, at one point, I think where we have the earliest attestation, it's something like 60 or 70 of the Psalms are actually attributed to David. Much later in the manuscript tradition, it grows, to eventually you've got entire, you've got attributions, obviously incorrect attributions of just collectively calling the Psalms, the Psalms of David. So.
Did you have a final question, Dr. Kipp, or?
Yeah,
or
I've got one more.
One more.
Or are we? Is this our last one, or
this is our last
going?
one? So I want to allow, if everybody has something to say on this, that's fine. I don't want to keep stretching it. We'll go to Q&A.
Okay, I think in I'm trying. We didn't really get into your, and maybe that's where you can go with your answer here, into your specific model for the I guess the authorship of Isaiah. I'm interested to know in particular with the two texts that I think we can all agree are certainly not written by Isaiah, and that would be the biographical material between 36 and 39, which is I know I said it's verbatim. It's not quite verbatim, but it's very, very close. Very obviously, drawn directly, or very obviously drawn directly from the Deuteronomistic history, depending on how you date these things. So there's this, and then there is the prophecy in 15 to 16, which looks again almost identical to what we see in Jeremiah 48. So I guess what I'm interested in, and so I will say with the Deuteronomistic history too, the reason why scholars tend to see this as pulled out of the Deuteronomistic history and plugged into Isaiah, and not the other way around, where this is something that Isaiah wrote that was thrown back into the Deuteronomistic history, is because of the way that it fits so nicely within the entire running narrative of the Deuteronomistic history. So I guess what I'm interested to hear from you guys is how does this fit within your model of the composition of Isaiah, and maybe in particular the Jeremiah text, because on the surface of it and on the basis of the traditional view, this is a prophecy that is attributed to, independently to two different prophets.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that. And no, good points that you're raising, Kipp. First let's talk about the Jeremiah. I know you were asking about that in particularly, but I'd probably say that, how do I factor that in that Jeremiah is aware of the Isaiah prophecy? And how much does that change things? Well, I see how, placing it in that section seems like it makes it fit, but how do I come to that determination, even though it may look like that, from your standpoint? And so if they're aware of the other, the prophecies, obviously they're familiar with their Jewish history and their writings. Why would I then attribute that to maybe somebody else, or there's a design issue that they're trying to build here, or a narrative that they're trying to create to kind of promote their propaganda per se? So if we, I'll let your thoughts on that, Kipp. So that's what I'm trying to understand.
Well,
Okay.
I'll jump in and defend Jonathan there, because I'm not convinced that Isaiah is the source of Jeremiah. Or the other way. I mean, I'm not convinced of which way it goes. I think it's really hard actually to read that text. So I'm not 100% convinced of the directionality. So I would cede that point in any debate about which way that really went. But I think there's the two texts that are the most telling for me in First Isaiah are the little apocalypse in 24 to 27. And then the biographical part in 36 to 39. So the part, because the part that's taken, that serves just as a bridge between what happens in 1 through 33, basically. Then we get 34, 35, and then 36 through 39, which basically just kind of fills in some gaps, fixes some stuff, and it's like it just pops in there. And so that already covered that. But for me, 24 to 27 is like this apocalyptic thing. And actually, Christopher Hayes has this great book that just came out recently that dates that to the time of Josiah, where he's still dating it later, but he's trying to argue that it's still pre-exilic. And he does make some good points. And so I don't know if I'm convinced yet, but I'm more sympathetic than I was, I think, to a pre-exilic dating. But still, it's like, even if we move it to Josiah's time, we're still showing that this is a growing text. This is a changing text. It's a composite text, whatever you want to say. And so I just think we need to answer those questions. Yeah.
All right, so we're out of time in this. Emma, did you have any final word you wanted to add to it, or do we want to move on to Q&A?
Nothing to add. We can move on to Q&A.
Awesome. So I'm going to be hanging out with you. I'm sorry you have to put up with me for the next, I don't know how long it takes to get through the Q&A, and then we'll do our final conclusions, 5 minutes each team or something about that. I won't crucify you for it. I can tell you that much. So, and we'll just go from there. So Constellation Pegasus, I'm back at the top. And he says, did Kipp watch that 1977 Noah's Ark movie? You're muted, I believe.
Not yet.
Oh, no, you're good.
Am I on now? No, not yet. So I did a stream on Gnostic Informants channel on Easter Sunday, and it devolved into a discussion of terrible B Christian movies from the 1970s. and this is one that I haven't seen. So sorry, Constellation Pegasus. I'll get around to it when I can. I'm excited about it.
Thank you for that. Robert Herring said, just sending love to all. Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate the love. Doc Pluralmanaut. And anyone, if you feel like you got an answer or want to say something, I'm going to have these, unless it's like specifically directed to someone, but maybe you even have something you want to comment on that. Doc Pluralmanaut says, Isaiah ben Amos wrote 2 other works chronicling Uzziah and Hezekiah. Chronicles knows and cites them, yet are never canonized. Why exclude 2 books of history, yet embrace a 3rd work of prophecy? History is an afterthought.
Why exclude 2 books of history?
I'll just answer real quick on my thought, unless you want to jump in, Kipp.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think when we look at the Orthodox Jewish canon, and when we look at what has come down, or at least in the Hellenistic traditions, especially with the Septuagint, we have a number of writings. I mean, I'd probably ask, while it may know some of these writings, I think the Jewish people, and not just to quote Josephus, but Josephus knew of a lot of these other works that came in after these periods that were not from their prophets or their writers. And I think it's important to understand that the Jewish people did feel they had a system where they believed that not only that the canon was closed, but they were able to identify, even with Baruch. We have Baruch's work, there, Jeremiah, but there's other works that have come in to identify with Baruch that is not part of their Orthodox Jewish canon. And I think it does go back to the fact that are the Jews, who are relevant witnesses and guardian of text, understand where their text came from. It seems like in their literature, they did understand where they were getting things from, and they had a system in place, probably even better than the Christians, to organize and know what was coming in. And I'll end there.
Yeah, so I might just want to jump in and explain to people what this question is about, in case the viewers out there don't know kind of what the background is. But it's like 2nd Chronicles literally says that Isaiah ben Amos wrote some other stuff. And so this is like, so if I can just read from 2nd Chronicles 26:22, says, now the remainder of the words of Uzziah, from the first to the last, Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, wrote them. And so that's a citation. And it also happens with Hezekiah. So these are cited by the Book of Chronicles, by the chronicler, and saying that Isaiah wrote the histories of these. And so how I understand this question is then, I feel like there's an assumption here that these are 2 books of history, one the history of Uzziah and one the history of Hezekiah, that Isaiah would have written. And so I would dispute that. First, I would say that there probably weren't separate histories written about Uzziah and Hezekiah. I would doubt that there's a reference or a book or an actual document behind this at all. I think this is just the chronicler saying that, oh yeah, we know about the book of Isaiah, and in the book of Isaiah there is reference to the time of Uzziah and Hezekiah, and so it's basically kind of like triangulating his reference and his work, and saying that Isaiah wrote about these dudes, and then some of the stuff that we see in Chronicles is found in Isaiah. So like we do have some intertextuality there, that the chronicler does know about these same texts, and so I really don't think that that there would be anything to canonize. I think the chronicler is just kind of using Isaiah as his authority, not necessarily as a source in everything, but as the person who gives him the authority to say these things.
Awesome. All right, we'll keep moving on then. MJT532, thank you. Does Isaiah 64, 10 through 12 make sense if written in 700s BC? The temple, not just the city, are destroyed. Is Isaiah praying to God 200 years in advance?
It depends which worldview you come from. And I think I alluded to something like this at probably the end of the opening. And it goes back to Mark Twain and Nikolai Berdyaev position that when we look at the history of the Jews, it's very difficult to understand it from a materialist interpretation of history. That those are two scholars who obviously Berdyaev, who was a prior Marxist, that was very familiar with the materialist interpretation of history. He felt like he couldn't reconcile it looking at the history. And so I think when we look at this question and what the book of Isaiah is suggesting, and we're trying to fit it into a naturalist or materialist interpretation of history, no, I don't think it makes sense. I think operating from the Christian worldview, the way we understand this, I would say yes.
Jonathan, if I could, can I read this so we could press on this one little thing? Because I think it's worth reading. Of course, everybody has a bias, right? And this is the point Jonathan's trying to point out. But I want to read this passage 10 through 12, and then love to see you press each other on this, if you don't mind. I'll get out so you guys can claw each other to death. No. Your holy cities have become a wilderness. Zion has become a wilderness. Jerusalem a desolation. Our holy and beautiful house, where our fathers praised you, has been burned by fire, and all our pleasant places have become ruins. Will you restrain yourself at these things, O Lord? Will you keep silent and afflict us so terribly? So pressing that question a little further, what do you see in the text there that might, like if you're looking at this from the scholar side, do you see something in that text that makes you think, this definitely sounds like they're living through this rather than it's 200 years in the future?
I don't think so, and I'll let Matt and Kipp respond. The reason being, and one of the points I made in my opening presentation, why I don't think it's much of a prophecy, the same way that Matthew or Mark, where we see prophecies to the temple being destroyed, is because one of the things, the Jews have been under constant attack from the very beginning. We see this going back with the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So this language, for me, while I may understand it to be I don't think it's too difficult to see through, given the Jewish history as a whole, even up to this time, that they would foresee tough times. And it goes back to Tacitus's perception of the situation with the Jews. The Jews built these walls and these structures because they knew they were going to prepare for war, and they were going to have these issues. So for me, I don't see much in terms of pressing a prophecy here. Matthew and Kipp, maybe you see it a little different.
So yeah, I mean, so here's where I see as is fairly problematic with that idea. At the time that Isaiah is writing, there's he's the city of Jerusalem and who knows, at what point, for I mean, I don't know whether the traditional view had attempted to actually locate individual prophecies within the life of Isaiah. I have no idea about that, but within the life of Isaiah, he's seen the Syro-Ephraimite War, and they've come. They survived that. In fact, as a result of the Syro-Ephraimite War, and then as a result of the Assyrian invasion and destruction of Samaria and the northern kingdom, this created an enormous influx of refugees, which resulted in an explosion of the population of Jerusalem. So for much of Isaiah's ministry, the city is, there's this stuff going on around them. And yes, they, miraculously survived this, and I say that using the I guess the
Kipp just lost the debate, everybody, and
I know, right? This is using the naturalistic definition of miraculous here. So they very surprisingly survived this Assyrian incursion into the south. But for most of the time, the city is growing. It's stable. The economy is good, and life is for within the temple certainly. And if you look throughout, I guess those parts of the text which look like they very clearly come from the 7th the 8th century, early 7th century, this is not really the focus here. And one more thing I will say is we have established here as well that not every type of literature survives. We have before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there were all sorts of texts that we had no idea even existed, but now actually look like they probably enjoyed some prominence and popularity in the time of in Second Temple Judaism. And I think the problem that this text raises is how on earth does something like this sit within the imagination of the people of 8th century Jerusalem, and why on earth would anybody continue to copy that and transmit that for hundreds of years, during the relative stability of the Jerusalem temple in the city of Jerusalem? This is this is really where some of this stuff gets really problematic, because not only is a text like this speaking not of this as a prophetic utterance, but this sounds very much like a description of the way things are.
Yeah, I want to jump in and save Kipp there from his miraculous.
From the miraculous, thank you.
From the miraculous, because it's just, I think calling it miraculous is just to not know history. Jerusalem is in between Egypt and the empires of the north. And so there is this ebb and flow of the empires from at least from the Bronze Age, if not before, where there is Egyptian influence from the south, and there is other influence. I got to find where my hand is on this camera, from the north, and it's pushing down through the Levant, and that is the bridge between Egypt and Assyria or Babylonia, depending on who it is, and then I guess the Greeks after. And so to say that it's miraculous that Jerusalem survives is actually not true, because they literally just went to the Egyptians and said, "Hey, Egypt, save us." We have it in the book of Isaiah too. Like, that's how they miraculously got out of it, was that when it got too rough, They said, hey, Egypt, protect us. Egypt says, yep, that's good. And it works for a while. And then the Babylonians do have to come, and they do want to win. They don't care about Jerusalem. What they care about is Egypt. Controlling the whole Levant is a way of keeping the Egyptians at bay. And so it's like it makes sense historically. You know, there's not a part there where we're going, dude, how did that giant army just get defeated? No, they got scared off by the Egyptians.
Thank you so much. We're going to keep moving on. Man. Got a bunch of super chats we want to make sure we get through. Doc Pluralmanat, again, thank you. At least David Koresh agreed in the Isaiah prophecy as his name is an amalgam of the two messiahs, David and Cyrus in Hebrew. So pretty good.
Nice. That's so good.
He's clever. I'm telling you. Doc's back again. Says, how do you explain Christian commentaries are silent that Targumist identified the loved one as Abraham emphasized in 51:2 and ignore multiple Cyrus interpolations affecting the meter rhythm of 45:1?
So I think this is a rhetorical question because I think what the doc is getting at is, well, I guess Jonathan will have to answer it anyway, but you would like to see any commentary discuss this. So Jonathan, do you have any thoughts on this?
By the way, don't feel bad. Doc is like kind of a genius, so don't.
No, it's still trying to hover back with my crystal ball and read into the minds of scribes why they did things or why they didn't. And obviously I have questions on the New Testament side of things as well, but I mean, I really don't know without speculating way too much. I'm stuck there. I don't want to give an answer. I really don't know.
Emma, do you want to comment? By the way, butt in, when dudes are talking, hey, hold on. Did you want to add anything to that or just?
Not to this question. I am a little confused about the question, to be honest. So
he does that to me too. Don't feel bad. Thank you so much, Doc. Sleep Bailiff, thank you so much for the super chat. And so what is the earliest manuscript of Isaiah dated to? I just wonder about that.
Kipp.
Michael Langlois did the most recent dating of the 1Q Isaiah A, which actually is the oldest of the Isaiah manuscripts, and he dates it to somewhere between 130 and like 70 or 80 BC.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. Omega, let's just say Omega, said, Emma, while you are clearly intelligent and highly articulate in your writing skills, I was distracted by the small insult to the intellect of your opponents in your opening statement, and then followed up with, no matter how brief or mild it was, glad you admitted you need to learn more about how historiography works. I think we all can learn. Even the experts on the screen can learn more. We all can. But did you want to comment on that? It seemed like he's calling you out.
Yeah, sure. If I'm just assuming maybe that person is talking about how I said there was no evidence. I was giving that illustration of a court scene just to give like a little icebreaker into there, and just picturing like what we do expect in a court case. I got into this a little bit when I was talking about the Mark 16 debate. I will be the first to say that I am definitely the one with the least knowledge on this call. I'm only 17. I'm in high school. So if I insulted the other team, that was not my intention in any way. I will gladly say that they have PhDs. I do not have a PhD. And so yes, definitely need to learn more. And I'm sorry if it came across that way.
See, I didn't even notice. No, I didn't even notice. And to be fair to Emma, she wrote that before she saw all the evidence. Right?
Yeah. But to be honest, like I've been called much worse things to my face by. So I didn't even.
Well, all right. Thank you so much. Apollo's Christian Apologetics. Thank you for the super chat. Haven't seen the separate text manuscripts, but what indicates their wholeness? Are they scrolls?
Yeah, I think so. If I understand the question correctly, it's a really good question. So I'm gonna assume that I understand it as I'm going to answer it, because it's a really, really good question. How do you assume that something is whole? And this is something that has plagued recent scholarship, is the assumptions that something was whole, because we don't always have methods to prove it. So one way of knowing something is whole is that it is whole. Okay, you can have a handle sheet on the one side and the end of a book on the other, and then we basically can see by the way it's rolled that there could not have been anything else inside of it, and it completes one literary composition from antiquity, and we can say, hey, hallelujah, it's a whole scroll. Like it's possible. Beyond that, we have material methods to reconstruct the size of scrolls. Basically, what this means is that we know basically the limits of how big a scroll was in antiquity, and we can also use methods to see how something was rolled. And one of the ways that you can see is through patterns of damage. So if you have something that's rolled up and you cut through it, then that damage is going to be repeated on successive rolls of the scroll that will get closer and closer together as you roll inward in the scroll, right? Because obviously the longest roll is on the outside, so it's more distance between those cut patterns, and then it gets smaller and smaller as you roll in. So that's one way we can kind of evaluate the scroll's material features and get a size out of it, and then we can see what text is there, and then basically calculate, is there room for it within the limits of what we think this scroll was. Another thing we can do is look at the size of the columns, because there is a proportionate relationship between the size of the columns of writing and the length of a scroll. So the higher and wider your columns are, the more likely it is that you would have a long scroll with a lot of text. So when we have scrolls that have, say, 20 to 25 lines, then we're thinking it's probably a good size scroll. If we have 40 lines, we're thinking this is huge. And so like when we have entire book of Isaiah, we need it to have 30 plus lines, and it needs to be a very, very, very long scroll, like at the absolute limits of any scrolls we've ever found. And so when we find things that are smaller than that, but within that, what we see is only a subset of texts, we can kind of calculate on either end where the limits would be for that collection, and then call it a whole scroll of this portion. So like we might say that some of the Qumran Cave 4 scrolls of Isaiah show that like they begin with chapter 1, and by the time we get to the last texts, which are out in chapter 20 or chapter 30, like we can see that there wouldn't be physically possible to include the entire book. So we're able to calculate those limits kind of based on triangulating and material reconstructions.
Hey, can I show a picture?
Sure.
Yeah. So just to kind of illustrate part of what Matthew is talking about here. This is one of my favorites. Does everybody see this? It's a fragment from a manuscript. Do you see the fragment from the manuscript, guys?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this is a fragment from the book of Jeremiah. And do people see my cursor?
Yes.
Floating around here. So notice you've got these little, what do you call these? I guess these little protrusions that go out the top. They get progressively bigger as we go to the left here. And so they're smaller on the right and they get a little bit bigger, and you'll notice the space in between them gets smaller. So this is the kind of damage pattern that that Matthew's talking about, and this is specifically something that occurs at the end of a manuscript, because traditionally speaking, manuscripts were rolled from the end to the beginning, so that the end was on the inside and the beginning was on the outside. It made it very convenient for reading because you just open it up and you can start at the beginning, right? The assholes were the guys who, you know, rolled them in correctly, so that in order to read the book, you had to like pull the whole thing out in order to start at the beginning. But anyways, so this is a manuscript actually of Jeremiah, and the text on this this fragment is from the I think it's is it Jeremiah chapter 44, which is the last, which is at the very end of the Septuagint version of Jeremiah. So even though we just have this one fragment, this is a very good indication, based on the way it's rolled. We know that this was at the end of the scroll, judging from the damage patterns. And even more exciting, we know with some pretty high confidence just from this fragment that this was probably a scroll that contained something that looked like the Septuagint version of Jeremiah, but in Hebrew. So yeah, there's things that we can do which indicate to us features of what a manuscript looked like, even though it's been badly deteriorated. But that is a great question.
Awesome. We're going to keep moving. I've got quite a bit of super chats here, so we got to keep flying through these. Explain why we find concentration of cosmological creation language, bara, in Isaiah 40 to 48 that is absent in 49 to 55. Even the theme of the servant and Cyrus' victorious expectations are missing.
Who's going to answer? Is that for that? That's not for us, is it?
Well, yeah, I think it's for anybody who cares. I mean, so I don't know. I feel like this is a question again that kind of leads to more discussion about the segmentation of the sources, because this is a pretty clear part of recent scholarship on Isaiah, is that 40 to 48 is kind of a kernel in Deutero-Isaiah, and then that the other parts are added on to that. It kind of develops also diachronically, and so the presence of specific language there is related to the composition of that layer of Deutero-Isaiah, and so I think like it's just that's what that specific. I mean, the theory today would be that's what that specific author was interested in. That was part of their literary apparatus that they were using, was this bara terminology, this kind of stuff. So I think it's I feel like it's a leading question, because what it's doing is just kind of proving the point that we should have made already, that Isaiah 40 to 48 kind of serves in contemporary scholarship as the basis for the developing Deutero-Isaiah as well.
Awesome. Did you want to respond to that, Emma or Jonathan, or keep going? All right. Aaron, thank you for the super chat. Samuel didn't write the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel 25:1, and I expect that Priest compiled Isaiah similarly. See intros, third person reference to other sources. Would you want to respond to that, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think I sort of brought this up, because in the Jewish literature, it does make a reference to Samuel. I think it's talking about his death or at that point. But it does point out that they did say who the person was that wrote it afterwards. And I think one of my points was part of that is in Samuel, in Joshua, and at the end of Deuteronomy, it does go ahead and give specific attestation to who they identified as the author of the expanded part of that section, or who was finishing up the compilation. But, my point was, I don't see those names for Isaiah, whether it's in the Jewish literature or anywhere else. And I'm just trying to understand that we do have a period where they did notice stuff. I mean, Jeremiah did notice, or in Jeremiah, when the scroll of Jeremiah or Baruch was burned, they noticed that in that period, but they didn't notice who was contributing these other sections to the book. And, we don't have that Ezra or person or that mechanism to standardize. For me, I'm looking for, where's Jerome over here, or a figure like him to do for Judaism what he did for Western Christianity on the Vulgate. So that was my point there. That's what I'm trying to look for in terms of evidential value.
Want to keep moving, or did you guys want to make a brief comment, or just keep going?
Just a brief comment that I think that what I see in this question is reading something into the text we can't really find. Saying that priests compiled Isaiah similarly or something, but I like your style because I think what you kind of get into there is the question of who was really doing the writing in ancient Israel. And that's one thing we haven't really talked about. We're talking about if we allowed Jeremiah to be the source of our information about how many people went into the captivity, then we have, like, somebody correct me, but like 4,600 or something like that. I think there's some number that Jeremiah gives. We're talking about like a few thousand people in the Babylonian captivity, right? And so this isn't like, we're not talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. We're not talking millions of people that would have an illiterati that is ridiculously abundant. We just simply don't know, though, how many people were writing texts in ancient Israel. But one thing we do know is that the texts that we do have are incredibly influenced by priestly concerns. And so I think, like, the logic of this question is not bad. So, but we just don't know. We just don't have answers.
Thank you so much, Nikolai, Dimov, Kipp, and Matthew. What is your opinion on who the suffering servant in Isaiah 53 is?
I did a video with Apologia all about this at Christmas time, so everybody should go and watch it because it's pretty great. But just to repeat what I said there, there's all sorts of ideas about who the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 is, and one of the problems with the servant of Isaiah 53 as part of a larger tradition of quote so-called servant songs within Isaiah is there are clear texts where the servant is identified explicitly as Israel, as a personification of the nation of Israel. There are other parts of the literature which seem to indicate that this is an actual individual, a person who might have lived or and possibly died. So I've seen I think it's Joseph Blenkinsop actually likes to say that the suffering servant in Isaiah 53 is actually the leader of this so-called Deutero-Isaiah community that put together the servant songs, and that he went through this persecution, martyrdom process that we see depicted in Isaiah 53. I'm not so keen on that idea. I prefer to think that the servant in Isaiah 53 works just fine as a personification of, I don't think all of Israel, but probably like a group, a remnant within the nation of Israel, that, or I guess within the Judean exiles, that's viewed as the future hope. And I've said on a few occasions that I think the servant in Isaiah 53. The servants, the servant or servants in the servant songs are actually modeled on the person of Jeremiah. And there's some a number of indicators within the text itself, which shows, an awareness of Jeremiah, and particularly drawing from Jeremiah's confessions in Jeremiah chapter 11 through 25, roughly thereabout, which show that this was sort of the model for who the servant was in a number of these texts.
I'll just say I think it's Israel. I think Hugh Williamson argues it pretty well. I like Israel for that job, but okay, well, I'll let the other side have their say.
You're muted, Jonathan.
Emma, do you want to give your interpretation of who the suffering servant is in 53? And I do want to throw in something from Matthew on there for the suffering servant or being Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I'll make this quick because I'm not sure it's going to be a shocker, but we definitely that is Jesus.
You guys are awesome. Oh, I was really on the edge of my seat wondering what's the answer going to be. Did you want to mention one of the rabbis just briefly that you were talking about?
Yeah. To address the comment that was asked previously, that was someone I was quoting. That was not my own rhetoric. So
and that was Rabbi Solomon of Barcelona. So there was, which ties into this a little bit because there was interreligious polemics going on with the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims. So that quote on anyone with a brain in his head. And if you got to think about it, the Jews were living under Muslim occupation in Spain. The Moors were in there for all those years. So they couldn't go out and directly attack the Quran. It would have been a death sentence for them. And that was their polemic response back to Muslim or the Muslim clerics and scholars. So, yeah, Emma wasn't calling Kipp and Matthew not using their brain. That and I think Emma put it in her PowerPoint, the actual quotation from Rabbi Solomon of Barcelona.
She did it just great. They're just trying to be mean to her. Don't worry about
it.
It's all good.
And on that question of the suffering servant, Matthew, do you think it's odd that obviously after the Christians take back Jerusalem, and then Christians are starting to win the war, turn the tide on Islam, and we're becoming the dominant, or Christianity is becoming a dominant force that the Jews do have to deal with? And I think Rabbi Solomon of Barcelona brings up that point. We're hearing endless on end. Do you see a correlation between that, Christians coming to power after the First Crusade, and then Rashi coming out with that interpretation that obviously Maimonides didn't take in? Any correlation there from your standpoint on that interpretation of Israel?
Oh, wow.
It's a good question, actually.
It is a really good question. I haven't thought about that, Jonathan. So I'm not going to put my foot in my mouth. So I think I'm just going to say that's really interesting. I have to think about that.
I will make just one brief comment. I've interviewed with she's a rabbi as well as brilliant Bible scholar, and I don't know why I'm drawing blanks at this moment. Anyway, she pretty much says that the interpretation could be Israel, but she also says it could be an individual, which, like Dr. Kipp pointed out, but she does not conclude that in its original context it meant what Christians interpret it to mean. But she also wants to have Jews understand why Christians take those interpretations, etc. Moving forward, Derek say Ami-God, then substitute Gaia for God. Ami-Gaia. It was the anyone with a brain comment, and yes, it was premature. The point of my comment, she, her pronouns. I apologize. I think I might have referred to you in like masculine pronouns. So my fault. And thank you again for the support, the super chat. I appreciate you clarifying there. A few more, and then we are wrapping up with your conclusions. Mitch Mazerow, while the veracity of Isaiah writ whole may be in dispute, it's clear that Jonathan's intro and outro artwork is inspired. Great debate stream today. Thank you.
Thank you for that compliment.
Agreed.
Yeah.
He is the cartoon guy. Really good at it. And then Aaron says, if Isaiah was the author, wouldn't it be great if he would have published the book with a commentary and an autobiography?
We could say the same for John in Revelation.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let's do our closing. Few minutes each on each team. Who wants to go first? You want to go first, Matthew? All right, let me pop you up here. Are we doing 5 minutes?
Yeah. So and I'm gonna want to share my screen. I don't know how long it's gonna take. I'm just gonna do a little thing.
Okay.
But I'm gonna want to share my screen if I can make it work here.
Okay.
Let's see.
Let me know when you got it up, and I'll pop it up.
Trying to find my keynote. There we go. Let's try that. Sorry, should have practiced. There it is. Yeah, why don't somebody else go?
Okay, so did you want to pop your screen up, Jonathan? Or here we go. I think you're up, Monger.
Yeah.
He's got it.
Oh,
Is there anything there?
Blank screen, black.
You're kidding. Okay, go on and get.
Okay, so we're gonna go with Jonathan here. Where are you at, Jonathan?
okay, yeah, I wasn't gonna share my screen.
I'll just have you pop up, and then do you want to do like 2 minutes or 2.5, and then Emma 2.5?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Cool. Go ahead, brother.
Okay. So, one of the things I wanted to get through in my opening statement is, what I see as what has evidential value in this question for me. And I think, one of the things I want to point out is for one of the first times in history, we do see where the Jews became the friends of the Persian Empire. And obviously, we see this very same anomaly happen under the time of Alexander. And in both these cases, we do have reports of a book being presented to these men who are not part of the Enlightenment, which from their worldview, they would naturally value from that friend-enemy distinction. And when we then factor in a host of circumstantial data that we have, the political influence that the Jews were able to hold sway over against the nations that didn't want them there, the fact that this whole project to rebuild the temple, start up the sacrifices, and build Jerusalem was all paid for. Their returns were given back. They held prerogative over the land. They told people, no, you can't come into the temple. And given their disposition that they did not have any value, any political influence, this was only a small group that was leaving Babylon. Most of them stayed in Babylon. What would it have taken for the Persian king to do this? And from my evaluation of the direct and circumstantial evidence, the entity here would be Isaiah. And with that, I see that as the simplest explanation to explain all those factors. Now, turn over to Emma, the last couple of minutes.
Thank you, Jonathan. All right, we're going to have Emma up. Go ahead, Emma.
Yeah, so essentially, I think, and again, I've only been studying this specific topic for around a month now, but I think on the other side, thinking that Isaiah was written by multiple authors, I still think there's some more evidence I'd like to see to substantiate that assumption. I also, again, am curious to know that mechanism of adding second or third Isaiah, if it was written in a later period, how that would have been able to be added to essentially all the manuscripts and not be detected. But also talking about what was previously discussed, almost that Isaiah is kind of like, for example, Psalms, that it's just a compilation of prophecies. I guess my question to that and my challenge to that would be how that assumption wasn't picked up on throughout history. I know that Psalms is written by, there's many people who have contributed to Psalms. A lot of it is written by King David, but numerous people have contributed. And that's because it's clear in the text. You can see that. You can say that this is a psalm by Moses or a psalm by the sons of Korah, for example. And I just don't really see that in the book of Isaiah, and how we would go all this time in history and really largely believe that Isaiah was written by Isaiah instead of written as a compilation of numerous prophecies. So essentially, those are kind of my arguments and my concerns when given the theory of second and third Isaiah. And ultimately, that's basically just a recap of my arguments. And yeah, I just want to say thank you for having me, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to share.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Emma. I really appreciate the closing statements there. And now we're going to move on to Dr. Monger. Matthew Monger. Feels awkward. He told me to just call him Matthew, so let's go to that.
You can call me whatever you want, Eric. So yeah, Kipp is going to share. If we can share Kipp's screen, then we'll pop that up. That's me. There we go. So I want to start by reading a passage from a book. It begins with fact. The Priory of Zion, a European secret society founded in 1099, is a real organization. ... The Vatican prelature, known as Opus Dei, is a deeply devout Catholic sect. ... All descriptions of artwork, architecture, documents, and secret rituals in this novel are accurate. We should thus read everything that follows as truth, because the book itself has told us everything is truth. Yes? Good. Move on to the next slide. Sorry, that was the Da Vinci Code. Now let's go on to the next slide, Kipp. Fourth Ezra, a book that is in many Bibles, but not in the Protestant canon, begins like this. The second book of the prophet Ezra, the son of Shariah, son of Azariah, son of Hilkiah, son of son of Aaron, of the tribe of Levi, who was captive in the country of the Medes in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of the Persians. So this is the beginning of Fourth Ezra. Says it is the second book of Ezra. Now, next quote, please, Kipp. In the Latin version of Fourth Ezra, Chapter 7, we read, "For my son, Jesus the Messiah, shall be revealed with those of you who are with him, and those of you who remain shall rejoice 400 years. And after these years, Christ the Messiah shall die, and all who draw human breath." Given the methodologies that have been presented by the other side today, I would argue that the book of Fourth Ezra needs to be read as attributed to the actual scribe Ezra, if we're going to take seriously that medieval or earlier attributions should be given weight. The problem here is that every scholar that has ever worked with the book places it in the at the end of the Second Temple period, after the destruction of the Second Temple. What we learn from this is that working with ancient literature doesn't necessarily come easy. We cannot just go by the attributions that are in the text. We have to study them carefully, imposing rigorous methods that we could apply to the Da Vinci Code as well as to biblical literature if we're going to come up with anything that's reasonable in its description of history. And I'll let Kipp take over from there.
So, and I have very little to add except for the fact that I think when we're beginning with these sorts of explorations, it's very important to begin with what we know. And what we know in this instance is what the manuscripts reveal to us. And what we have in the manuscript tradition for the book of Isaiah from the earliest period is that while there was some there is indications that the entire collection was already put together as late as the 2nd century. We also have clear indications of an Isaiah which was not necessarily whole writ, as we've discussed throughout this debate. And this is all tied back to how historians do history. When it comes to conducting an historical investigation of literature like something like the Book of Isaiah, it's important for historians to begin with what we call the terminus ad quem, which in this case would situate the text that we have no earlier than the 6th century BCE with the Edict of Cyrus.
Thank you so much for that, Kipp. Let's get everybody back on the screen. I want to thank all of you for joining in this debate. Everybody in the chat, make your mind up on what you think about the debate. And thank you for letting me moderate this, coming up with the idea, Jonathan, and saying, hey, will you harass these guys? And you're muted, by the way.
Yes. No, thank you. And I think it's important as representatives of Christianity to actually engage the intellectual voice for our arguments. Emma, I got to actually judge her in live competitions down here at San Antonio at NCFCA. Just an incredible mind, very articulate, well-spoken. And this is, while people question and ask, why am I bringing on somebody that maybe doesn't have like 15,000 PhDs or has all this? Emma has dedicated her last 4 or 5 years to studying apologetics, spending time speaking and presenting and giving a good witness. What we want in these discussions is not a shouting match or Kipp, Matthew, you're wrong. We want to engage with our actual ideas and test our thesis against some of the best that can actually give us, relevant feedback for our arguments. And I think this is where they become a little bit more, obviously everyone wants to see the battle royal, but at the end of the day, we're trying to learn as well. And I think this type of format, where we want to be better representatives for Christianity and explaining more about why we believe is much more effective than having 4, 5, 6 PhDs on here arguing on, points of minutia. So I definitely thank Matthew and Kipp for giving us the opportunity and giving a chance for Emma, who's been participating in doing this, to actually engage in this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all. Emma, thank you so much. I do want everybody to know, if you aren't aware already, Kipp has a YouTube channel. Go subscribe to Dr. Kipp's YouTube channel. He will be away for a while he's working, work's picked up. Also, Jonathan has a YouTube channel. I'm hoping that we can get Emma and Matthew a YouTube channel at some point where we can actually start doing some content. And if we do, I will add it in the description of this debate. Anachronistically, you might think I put it in before or during the debate, but it will be after, and I'm making it on record so nobody gets confused. Seriously, though, I appreciate everybody. I don't know why I said that.
Good work there. I like that.
Thank you so much. Everybody go in the description. Go subscribe. Subscribe. Follow everybody and stay tuned because we're going to bring more here at MythVision. And never forget, we are MythVision.
Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.